The Black Hawk hit the ground hard. Dust erupted in a wall of orange and brown, swallowing everything beyond 10 meters. Mercer was already out before the skids stopped bouncing. Rifle up, eyes scanning left through the storm. "We've got visual," Hayes shouted over the rotor wash. "She's alive. She's right there." Mercer turned. Emma Callahan stood at the edge of the burned-out oil facility, backlit by a pillar of black smoke. Her uniform was shredded at the shoulder. Her face was hollow. Not hurt, not desperate, empty in a way that made his chest lock up. She had a rifle pointed at them. Nobody moved. Mercer lowered his weapon slowly. "Emma, it's over. We're here." She didn't lower hers. "You shouldn't have come back for me." The ground shook. A concussive wave rolled across the flat desert floor. Fire climbed the eastern tank battery. She had triggered it. Cut to black. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air conditioning that had been fighting a losing battle against the Syrian summer for longer than anyone cared to calculate. Emma Callahan sat in the back row with her arms crossed and her boots flat on the floor, watching Major Conrad Hale work the projector remote like a man who believed confidence could be performed through small gestures. He had one of those faces that never looked tired, square jaw, clean shave, the manufactured calm of an officer who'd spent more of his career behind desks than in the field. She'd clocked that about Hale the first time she'd met him, 3 weeks ago at Camp Conroy during the initial coordination meeting. He talked about operations the way accountants talked about budgets. Methodical, bloodless, wrong in ways that were hard to name exactly, but accumulated over time into something she didn't trust. "Objective Talon is a multi-phase disruption operation," Hale said, clicking to the first slide. "Satellite imagery. Eastern Syria, roughly 20 kilometers east of Deir ez-Zor." She'd studied the same imagery for 2 days and knew every pixel of it. The Al Omar oil fields from altitude looked like a steel graveyard. Tanks, pipe runs, processing buildings, all of it rusted and half collapsed. The kind of industrial decay that happened when a war moved through an area and left without cleaning up after itself. Phase 1 is reconnaissance and documentation. Phase 2 is sabotage of the primary fuel exchange node. Phase 3 is exfiltration via route Kestrel. He clicked to the next slide. Master Sergeant Jack Mercer was sitting 2 seats to her left. He had his arms folded and his boots flat, and he hadn't touched his coffee. Emma had worked with Mercer on 2 previous operations, Falcon Reach in Mali, where they'd spent 11 days tracking a weapons convoy through terrain that had no business being navigable, and the Kandahar follow-up that nobody officially talked about because the official version of what had happened there was wrong in ways that were convenient for people above their pay grade. She trusted Mercer the way she trusted a well-maintained rifle. Not blindly, not without limits, but with the specific confidence that came from watching someone make decisions under pressure and noting that the decisions were almost always correct. Mercer raised his hand. "What's the intel confidence level on that site?" Hale paused. It was a small pause, a half beat, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention to the space between words. Emma noticed it. "High." "That's not a number," Mercer said. "Is it satellite confirmed, HUMINT confirmed, or someone's best assessment based on adjacent data?" The Major's jaw tightened by a fraction. In the room, Sergeant Torres, Corporal Hayes, and Specialist Ruiz all found something interesting to examine in the middle distance. Nobody liked watching a senior NCO push back on an officer in a formal briefing, but nobody looked surprised either. Mercer had a reputation for exactly this kind of pushback, and the reputation had been built through enough operations that the people who'd worked with him understood it was the reason they were still alive to be uncomfortable about it. "The intelligence assessment," Hale said carefully, "is based on SIGINT intercepts cross-referenced with 2 HUMINT reports from vetted local sources. Confidence is assessed at 80%. Assessed by who? By JSOC Analytical Division. Mercer nodded once, slowly. He didn't look satisfied, but he let it go, and the briefing continued, and Emma filed away the half-beat pause, and the careful phrasing, and the way Hale had answered the second question slightly faster than the first, as though the second one was easier because it was further from something he didn't want to say directly. After the briefing broke, Mercer caught her at the door. "Watch the extraction routes," he said, quietly enough that it was just for her. "Route Kestrel has no natural cover for the first 4 kilometers east of the facility. If Phase 3 goes wrong before we're past that stretch, we'll be running in open ground." "I know," she said. "I know you know." He looked at her in the direct way he had, without apology for the directness. "I'm saying it anyway. The obvious things are the ones people stop seeing when the noise starts." She nodded. He walked past her into the corridor. She stood in the doorway for a moment and thought about the half-beat pause. Emma cleaned her rifle the way some people prayed, with focused attention and the particular comfort of repetitive action that required just enough concentration to quiet everything else. She was in the common area, a converted storage room that smelled like gun oil and boot leather, and the residual coffee burn from the briefing room 3 doors down. She sat on an overturned crate with the M4 broken down on a field cloth in front of her, working through each component in sequence. The bolt carrier group first, then the charging handle, then the buffer assembly. She ran the rod through the barrel twice, checked the gas port, wiped every surface, and checked the chamber with a flashlight before beginning reassembly. Torres came in at the halfway point, tossed a protein bar onto the cloth beside the field-stripped upper receiver, and dropped into the chair across from her. He was 26, Colombian-American, with a laugh that occupied more acoustic space than any room expected, and a fire discipline under contact that bordered on the preternatural. Emma had been his fire team partner for 7 months. She trusted him with the things she couldn't see from her own position, which was the highest form of trust available in their line of work. "Briefing was fun," Torres said. "Mercer's right about Route Kestrel," Emma said. "Mercer's always right about the routes." Torres pulled the tab on his protein bar, tore it with his teeth. He ate methodically, the way he did everything. "He's also right that Hale gives me a weird feeling." Emma paused the reassembly and looked up. "He's a staff officer running a field op in terrain he's never worked." "That's not the weird feeling." Torres held her gaze. "After the briefing, he came and found me in the chow line, asked what kind of comms kit we were running, said he needed it for the technical annex." He paused. "We briefed comms 2 weeks ago. He was in the room." Emma set the barrel section down on the cloth. "What did you tell him?" "Standard loadout, nothing sensitive." Torres looked at the protein bar. "Probably nothing. Maybe he's just thorough." She picked up the barrel again. "Maybe." She assembled the rifle in 41 seconds, cycled the bolt, set it down, and picked up the next component from the cloth. "Probably thorough." The phrase sat in the back of her mind with the particular weight of things that were possible but felt wrong, like a weight placed slightly off-center that you kept having to correct for. She assembled the second weapon, rechecked both, and packed her kit. In the evening, she ran 4 kilometers on the base perimeter road in the last of the daylight. The desert air at dusk was almost cool enough to make running bearable. She passed 2 other soldiers running in the opposite direction, and 3 vehicles heading toward the motor pool and the base's small fuel depot with its smell of aviation gas and hot pavement. She ran and kept her pace even and did not think about Hale. She thought about Mercer instead. She thought about the fact that he had been right about every route she could remember, and about the fact that he'd used the word wrong when describing Phase 3 contingencies, not difficult or complicated or any of the bureaucratic softeners people reach for when they wanted to sound cautious without committing to caution. Wrong meant he thought Phase 3 had a real chance of going wrong. She increased her pace for the last kilometer and showered in cold water and lay on her rack in the dark and ran the op in her head 4 times before she slept. The MH-60 came in low and dark, 30 meters above the desert floor, no running lights, the crew chief riding the door gun as a silhouette against a sky thick with stars. Emma sat in the back with Torres, Hayes, and Ruiz. Her gear was locked down tight, no rattling, no loose surfaces, everything in its designated position where she could find it in the dark by touch alone. She ran the checklist in her head for the last time. 4 magazines in the chest rig, plus 2 spares at the hip. Sidearm charged and holstered. Breaching kit stowed at the left thigh. Radio on 7 Charlie, encryption current. Trauma kit at the right lower back. She touched each item in sequence, not to confirm what she knew, but to establish the physical memory that would matter if she had to find something while someone was shooting at her. Mercer sat across the narrow cargo bay with his eyes closed and his head resting against the frame. She'd learned 2 years ago, after asking Torres about it, that this wasn't sleep. It was the way Mercer ran an operation in his head, walking every step, mapping every transition, looking for the seam where the plan came apart. He did it before every operation. He had never, to her knowledge, been caught unprepared for the specific way things went wrong. The flight was 42 minutes across Black Desert. Nobody spoke. The crew chief scanned the terrain below through his NVGs. The engine noise was the only thing in the world. When the MH-60 flared and the crew chief raised 2 fingers, they went out fast and quiet. 4 meters of scrub grass hardpan rushed up to meet her, and she absorbed the landing in her knees and came up, already crouching, rifle up, scanning left and then right. Nothing. Wind. Fine sand moving in low curtains across the ground, the grains catching starlight. The smell of diesel on the air, faint, directional, coming from the east, 2 kilometers out at minimum. The helicopter was lifting before she heard the sound of it going. One moment it was there, the next the sound was already reducing toward nothing, and the desert was completely silent. "Comms check," Mercer said, barely above conversational. "Lima Charlie," Emma said. Torres, Hayes, Ruiz, all confirmed clean. Mercer pointed east, and they moved. The terrain was exactly as bad as the satellite imagery had suggested, and worse in person. Flat, open, sparse scrub brush that provided visual concealment for nothing taller than knee height. The drone recon had shown a drainage system running north-south. She'd planned to use it for movement, but the actual wadi was shallower than the imagery indicated, barely a meter of depth at its lowest point. Enough to break a silhouette against the sky, not enough to move upright. She moved in a half-crouch, timing her breathing to her footsteps, scanning at 30-meter intervals. Mercer halted the column every 60 meters to thermal scan their flanks. Nothing warm except the desert itself, which radiated the day's stored heat from its surface in steady waves that were visible in the scope as a faint shimmer against the cooler air above. 2 kilometers in, Hayes raised a closed fist. Everyone dropped to one knee simultaneously, no sound. Emma swept right through her scope. Nothing. She swept left, slowly, reading the terrain by temperature gradient. At the top of her scan arc, barely visible above a concrete berm 400 meters north, a heat bloom appeared and faded. Appeared again, slightly weaker. Appeared a third time. Cigarette. Someone drawing on a cigarette, cupping it poorly. She turned to Mercer and pointed. 2 fingers, slow circle, indicating a wide berth south. He nodded. They detoured through a dry wadi that smelled like bleached stone and ancient rust, adding 20 minutes and 400 meters to the approach. They came out on the eastern side clean and slightly elevated, the facility's outer fence visible 300 meters ahead, the main structure a cluster of silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. Mercer crouched beside her. Count. She scanned the fence line. 3 guards visible, moving on rotations that were more regular than she'd expected. A fourth probable near the eastern gate. A fifth shadow near the main processing building that might have been a person or might have been equipment. 3 confirmed, 2 probable. Agrees with my count. He moved the thermal across the building faces. Generator running in the processing building, drawing substantial power. Equipment or lighting for active operations. Both, probably. He looked at her. North breach, you take Torres through the processing building. I hold South Gate with Hayes and Ruiz. The transfer node should be on the processing floor if the intel is right. If it's not, then we document what it actually is and we call it in before we touch anything. He was already moving into position. 15 minutes to breach. The bolt cutters were through the padlock in 8 seconds. Emma and Torres went in low. The processing building interior was a long, rectangular space with a corrugated metal roof and concrete walls that had been poured sometime in the previous decade and then left to do whatever concrete did without maintenance in a Syrian summer. Shelving units along the left wall, a long folding table at the far end with a laptop and 2 phones charging from a power strip connected to the extension cable they'd seen running from the eastern fence. Bare bulb overhead, off. A generator-fed emergency light near the ceiling, throwing orange emergency light that barely reached the middle of the room. The air hit her first. She recognized the smell before she had words for it. An arms cache in Mosul, 3 years ago. Old explosive compound, the specific chemical decay of PETN-based materials stored in marginal conditions. A smell like overripe chemical fruit that embedded in your sinuses and stayed for days. She'd smelled it twice since Mosul, and both times what she'd found afterward had been significant. She moved to the first crate on the shelving unit. Wood construction, recent, no stenciling. She pulled the lid with a controlled movement and held her light low and looked inside. Man-pads components. Shoulder-fired surface-to-air systems, partially disassembled, packed in gray closed-cell foam. She looked at the model. Russian design, late production, the kind of system that had been moving through the Syrian corridor for years in fragments, because fully assembled units were easier to intercept. You moved the components separately and assembled them at the point of use. She'd read the threat assessments. Second crate, RPG rounds and foam, a mix of anti-armor and thermobaric, enough to destroy a convoy or clear a building. Third crate was smaller. Inside, cellular detonator units in factory packaging, the seals still intact. Each unit was a remote trigger capable of initiating an improvised explosive device from up to 500 meters. She photographed each item in sequence, moving fast, the camera flash suppressed to a near-invisible dim. "This is a distribution point," she said quietly to Torres. "Not a hub. Someone's moving this stuff out in pieces and staging it here between transfers." Torres was at the far shelving unit. He turned his flashlight on a stack of documents in plastic folders. "Emma," she crossed to him. The documents were manifests. She could see at a glance that they were inventory sheets, Arabic and English, with a header format she'd seen before. She photographed the top 3 pages and looked more closely at the reference numbers in the header. She'd seen that reference format before, not the manifests themselves, but the structure of the numbers, the layering of source codes and verification strings. She'd seen it on JSOC operational documents. It was a verification format, an authenticity marker. Someone had embedded U.S. operational verification formatting in a black market weapons manifest. She stood with this for a moment. Then she moved to the laptop. The extraction tool took 3 minutes to pull whatever was accessible from the laptop's unencrypted partitions. Emma spent those 3 minutes standing at the center of the room, arms loose at her sides, listening. Wind, the generator hum, the soft creak of the corrugated roof expanding and contracting. Her own heartbeat, which was steady, as it always was just before something went sideways. She couldn't have explained the mechanism, a slight thickening of the air, a quality of stillness that was too deliberate, as though the environment was holding its breath. But she'd learned to trust the feeling, not as prophecy, but as signal. Her body had processed information her conscious mind hadn't fully assembled yet. The extraction drive pinged complete. She pulled it and pocketed it, looked at Torres. "We need to." The explosion was close enough to rattle the corrugated roof. Not inside the building, south face, near the gate. She felt the pressure wave through the concrete floor, a fraction of a second before the sound caught up. A vehicle IED or an RPG hit. The specific sharpness of the initial crack told her anti-armor, probably RPG. The radio came alive. "Contact south!" Ruiz's voice, high-pitched with controlled urgency. "We've got multiple vehicles. Hayes is down. He's down." Then the jammer hit, and the radio went to static, and stayed there. Emma was already moving. She came out of the north door at a dead sprint and cut south along the fence line, Torres 2 steps behind her. What she found at the south gate was controlled chaos at the tipping point. A vehicle on fire, one of the militia's late-model Toyotas, burning horizontally across the gate opening. Hayes had hit it with something, probably the AT-4 he'd been carrying, and the burning hulk was partially blocking a second vehicle that was trying to push through. 6 men behind the burning Toyota in covered positions, shooting north. Hayes was down behind a concrete barrier, not moving. Ruiz was at the east wall in a firing position, suppressing with controlled pairs. Mercer was dragging Hayes. Emma found a pipe junction on the north side of the gate approach and got into position. Her first shot found a target. Her second caught movement behind the Toyota's engine block, and she adjusted and fired twice more, and the movement stopped. Ruiz shifted fire, and she moved, 3 steps, low, into a better angle on the west side of the burning vehicle. Another shooter. She took him, but the sound from outside the fence had changed. More engines, coming from the east, more than 2 vehicles, the ground vibrating with the weight of something heavy moving fast. She pressed her hand to the dirt and felt it, the specific harmonic of multiple vehicle engines coordinating approach, not random patrol movement. This was not a guard response. This was a positioned reaction force. They had been waiting. She moved to Mercer on her hands and knees, staying below the sight line of the fence. This was a trap. Multiple vehicles inbound east. "I know." He had Hayes's arm over his shoulder, and Hayes was semi-conscious, one hand pressed to his thigh, where the blood was visible even in the orange firelight. Route Kestrel? Compromised. They came from the east. They knew the route. Alternate exit? Wadi South, 4 kilometers. But we have to move now. He nodded. "Get Torres. Take the south gap, 30 meters east of the burning vehicle. I'm behind you with Hayes." They were 40 meters from the perimeter fence when the ground came up and hit her. She didn't see the IED. She didn't hear the click. She heard the flat initial crack of the detonation, and then the pressure wave erased everything in a single physical instant. A wall of compressed air that picked her up and turned her sideways in the dark, and threw her an indeterminate distance that she was in no condition to measure. She hit a concrete drainage edge with her left shoulder and felt the joint given away that sent white light across her vision. Not broken, not fully dislocated. Something in the muscle structure, something that would matter in the next 10 hours. She lay still for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was the maximum she allowed herself for inventory. Then she rolled, got her knees under her, came up into a crouch, and breathed. Smoke everywhere. Flat, ringing silence replacing the explosion that her eardrums were processing as sound again in fragments. The crack of gunfire from the south, from the west. Her NVGs had gone dark. She pulled them off and blinked in the orange firelight that was now the primary illumination. "Torres!" No answer. She moved 5 steps north. "Torres!" She found him 15 meters back, face down in the scrub, and for one bad second her chest locked up. Then he moved. He rolled onto his back and looked up at her with both hands held up in the automatic gesture of someone checking their own damage. And she saw the blood on both palms. Shrapnel, multiple hits, deep enough to matter, but his hands were moving, which meant the tendons were intact. "Can you move?" she said. "Yes." He got up by himself, which was the only answer that mattered. The land cruiser they'd staged 2 kilometers north was on its side 400 meters away, burning. She tried the radio, static. She tried the secondary frequency, static. The jammer was still up, or the blast had done something to the encryption module. She looked north toward where Mercer had been. Smoke and gunfire in the orange light of 3 separate fires now. She took 2 steps toward it. Torres grabbed her arm. "He's out. I saw him go east right before the blast. He had haze." "You're sure?" "I'm sure. He was past the fence. He's out, Emma." She turned the information over. If Mercer was out in east, he'd pick up Route Bravo, the secondary, and it would take him north-northeast to the secondary LZ. He would get Hayes to the bird. He would call for her. He would call. She took one more look at the south gate and the smoke and the muzzle flashes moving west, and then she turned north into the dark and ran. She lost Torres in the 3rd drainage ditch when a search vehicle swung its lights across the flat, and they dove in opposite directions. She came up on the far bank and Torres was gone. She waited 4 seconds. Nothing. The vehicle was sweeping back. She went north, into the open desert, into absolute dark. Alone, with 3.5 magazines, a broken sidearm, an extraction drive in her pocket, and a shoulder that was going to be significantly worse by morning. Coda, FOB Copperhead, hours later. The last transmission Mercer copied before the jammer killed the frequency was a partial coordinate string in Emma's voice. Flat, precise, not panicked. The voice of someone who had accepted her situation and was processing it tactically. He triangulated the partial string on his map. North of the facility. Wrong direction for any of the planned extraction routes. She'd been pushed north, or chosen north, and either way she was alone. He held the radio in the medical bay while a corpsman worked on Hayes' thigh, the big man unconscious from blood loss and the sedative they'd administered. Hayes would keep his leg. The corpsman was confident about that. Mercer listened to the assessment and filed it away and held the radio. In the next 72 hours, he filed 11 separate requests. Rescue authorization, extended search grid, satellite tasking over the north grid, manned ISR coverage. Each request came back denied, delayed, or redirected, passing through the administrative routing that ran through Major Conrad Hale's office like all such requests did, generating language about hostile environment assessments and unconfirmed survivor indicators and operational risk calculus that meant nothing and changed nothing. On hour 73, JSOC officially reclassified Staff Sergeant Emma Reaper Callahan as KIA, presumed unrecovered. Mercer signed nothing. He put the radio down and looked at his map and started thinking about what happened next. She woke in a drainage ditch with sand in her teeth and one arm that was informing her, in the specific language of torn muscle, that she'd made a tactical error somewhere in the last 6 hours. Left shoulder. She rotated it carefully, 40 degrees before the pain went sharp and white, then backed off to 30, where it settled into something workable. Joint still seated, something in the posterior capsule, maybe the infraspinatus, pulled or partially torn. She had an intimate relationship with her own body's damage tolerance, built across a decade of work that didn't permit gradual recovery, and what her shoulder was telling her right now was functional with restrictions. She filed it under operational parameters and moved on. She sat up slowly and ran full inventory. M4 with 1 magazine loaded and 2 spares in the chest rig. 1 additional magazine at the hip. 4 total. Her 3 spares plus the one that had been in the weapon when the blast hit. The 4th spare was somewhere back at the south gate. She had 120 rounds. Sidearm, cracked frame, unsafe to fire. She stripped the magazine, counted 11 rounds, added them to the magazine in her chest pocket as loose ammunition she could hand-load if it came to that, and dropped the pistol in the ditch. Water, 1¾ full bottle, 4 protein bars, 1 trauma kit, 1 tourniquet, 2 pressure bandages, a chest seal, 4 feet of paracord. Shrapnel. Left thigh, lateral. She could feel the metal with 1 fingertip through a tear in the fabric. Not deep, she could press the area without the pain response of something embedded in muscle. Surface strike, lodged in subcutaneous tissue. She packed the entry with folded gauze, pressed until the bleeding slowed to ooze, and taped it. Radio. Dead. The jammer or the blast. She tried both frequencies twice and got nothing that wasn't static. Extraction drive. Present. Inner breast pocket. Intact. The photographs. Intact. She took stock of what she had and what she was, and then she stood up and looked at the desert. The sun was 2 hours old. The facility's smoke column was visible as a thin, dark smear to the south. The terrain was absolutely flat in every direction, sparse scrub brush and brown earth for as far as she could see. She needed to move north and hold cover and wait for an opportunity that didn't exist yet. She moved north. By noon, she had put 8 kilometers between herself and the smoke column, and the heat stroke was coming on. She recognized the symptoms with clinical precision because she'd been taught to, and because she'd been close to this line once before, in a training exercise in Arizona, where the cadre had pushed the evolution 2 hours past the safety margin. The difference between heat exhaustion and heat stroke was the point at which the brain lost reliable access to its own monitoring systems. The point where you stop being able to assess your own impairment because the organ doing the assessing was the one failing. She could still assess, which meant she was still on the right side of the line. She gave herself 20 minutes, maybe 30, before that changed. She found a culvert, concrete drainage infrastructure, half collapsed, the eastern section intact enough to provide 1.5 meters of shade. She crawled into it and stopped moving. Full stop. No movement except breathing. Every degree of core temperature she could prevent from rising in the next 90 minutes would matter in a meaningful way over the next 48 hours. She knew this with the specificity of someone who had studied the physiology because the physiology was operationally relevant. Not because she'd been afraid of it. She allowed herself 4 controlled swallows of water and held each one on her tongue for a count of 3 before swallowing. Hydration in heat exhaustion was counterproductive if consumed too fast. The stomach rejected it before the blood could absorb it. Slow was the only mechanism that worked. She lay on her back with her knees bent and her left arm at a comfortable angle that didn't stress the shoulder, and she breathed at a controlled rate, and she thought. She had the extraction drive in her inner breast pocket. The data from the laptop, whatever it contained, whatever the analysts at JSOC would eventually make of it, was 4 inches from her heart. That was the reason 7 people had gone into a facility in eastern Syria in the dark, and it was the reason at least 2 of them hadn't walked out under their own power. She didn't know Hayes' current status. She'd seen him take the round, seen the blood, thigh wound, which could be survivable or could not depending on the artery involvement and how fast Mercer had gotten him to a bird. She knew Torres had been alive at the moment of separation. Ruiz she didn't know at all. She'd heard his fire from the east wall, and then she hadn't. She organized what she knew into the 3 categories Mercer had drilled into her in Mali when their operation had fragmented on day 3, and they'd had to rebuild their operational picture from fragments while taking intermittent fire. Confirmed, the reaction force had been pre-positioned, not a guard response, a prepared ambush. Multiple vehicles on multiple approach vectors, including Route Kestrel, which had been disclosed to a limited audience during a formal briefing that she could name every attendee of. Someone who had been in that room, or had access to what was said in that room, had communicated the route to the network in advance. Confirmed. The facility was larger and more operationally significant than JSOC's intelligence assessment had indicated. Either the assessment was incomplete due to intelligence limitations, or it had been deliberately constructed to show less than the analyst knew. The second option was harder to accept and more consistent with everything else she was seeing. Probable. The incomplete assessment and the prepositioned reaction force were not two separate failures from two separate causes. They were the same failure manifested twice. One compromised source, two downstream effects. The identity of the source, the depth and duration of the breach, how long this had been running, how many operations it had touched before hers. Whether anyone in her chain of command was currently treating her situation as a recovery problem or had moved on to paperwork. She filed the unknown column and focused on what she could control, which right now was her core temperature and her water discipline, and the specific, unglamorous discipline of staying still in a concrete culvert in the Syrian desert while the sun tried to kill her. There was a scorpion at the far end of the culvert. She'd noted it when she crawled in. It was working its way along the base of the western wall with the particular purposefulness of something that owned this environment in a way she currently did not. She watched it for a while. It reached the wall junction and turned north and disappeared into a crack in the concrete. She thought about Mercer. She didn't let herself do it for long. There was no productive action available in that direction right now, but she let herself do it briefly. He would not accept the KIA classification. She was certain of that. Whatever the official determination was, whatever paperwork command was generating, Mercer would be filing something in the opposite direction. He had a stubbornness about him that was not emotional in origin. It was moral. He had a specific internal architecture that didn't permit certain conclusions when the evidence for those conclusions was insufficient. And he would apply that architecture to her status regardless of what the official record said. This was useful information. It meant someone was working the problem from the other end. She stayed in the culvert for 4 hours, checking her watch at 30-minute intervals, drinking 1 swallow per hour, and holding completely still between intervals. When the sun had dropped below 45 degrees and the ambient temperature had fallen enough to make movement survivable without a water reserve she didn't have, she crawled out. She went north. Slow, deliberate, staying in whatever ground cover existed, which was minimal. She covered 4 kilometers before dark and held in a shallow depression in the earth that was barely worth the description, and watched the stars come out over the Syrian desert and thought about the next day. She moved at night and held still during the day. She found water on day 2 at a rusted standpipe at an abandoned service station 6 kilometers north, enough to refill her bottle 3 times and drink as much as she could hold. It tasted like iron and old rubber, and she drank it slowly and held it down through an act of focused will. On day 3, she worked her way back toward the facility from the east. Not toward rescue, toward understanding. The eastern quadrant of the oil field was different from what the satellite imagery had shown, and different from what the team's reconnaissance had covered in the 40 minutes they'd had inside the facility before the contact. Less abandoned. Someone had run fresh power cable along the eastern fence line, heavy gauge, the kind that drew significant current, connected to the main generator via a junction box that was new enough that the weather hadn't oxidized the fittings yet. 3 of the secondary storage tanks on the east side showed maintenance that hadn't been there in the 6-month-old satellite imagery. New weld seams at the tank collars, fresh concrete poured at the base of the access stairs on 2 of them, and a sensor array mounted on the 3rd that had no business being on a decommissioned oil storage tank. She watched from behind a collapsed earthen berm for 4 hours, noting everything. The guard rotation in the eastern quadrant was different from the main facility, more disciplined. The men moving through this section had the particular quality of professional movement: spacing, observation arcs, the way they used terrain without being told to, that suggested either military background or extended paramilitary training. She counted 8 individuals in 4 hours of observation, 3 rotation cycles completed with less than 2 minutes of variance between them. Someone was running this section like a military installation. On the 3rd hour, she saw the vehicles. 3 flatbed trucks parked inside the eastern fence line, positioned so their beds faced the interior. 2 empty. The 3rd had a tarpaulin over the bed that sat high and irregular, the asymmetrical profile of covered equipment, not flat cargo. The wind lifted the tarp edge twice in the 4 hours she watched. Under it, wooden crating, the same construction she'd photographed in the processing building. The main facility was the intake point. The eastern quadrant was the output. The operation had 2 separate functions with 2 separate security profiles, and the half that JSOC's intelligence had covered was the less sensitive half. She pulled back east and held position. She needed more. Mercer had filed 11 requests and started the 12th when Torres appeared in the doorway of his quarters. Torres had been medevaced to Copperhead from the secondary LZ, arm in a sling, both hands wrapped in white gauze that was already spotted brown at the palm. He'd refused anything stronger than ibuprofen, which Mercer noted because it was consistent with everything he knew about Torres, and because it meant Torres was functional and capable of having a serious conversation. Torres didn't sit. He stood in the doorway with the particular stillness of someone who had decided what they were going to say before they said it. "She's not dead." Mercer looked up from the keyboard. "I know. They're listing her KIA. I know that too." Torres came into the room and stood over the desk. "Then what exactly are we doing?" "Filing requests." Mercer turned back to the keyboard. "Every official channel I have access to. ISR tasking, extended search authorization, survivor indicator protocol review." He stopped typing. His hands rested on the keys without pressing anything. "Command won't authorize an active recovery operation without a confirmed survivor indicator. Without a signal from Emma, there's no confirmed indicator. They're calling it a high-threat environment with no evidence of survivable escape." "She made it out," Torres said. "I saw her run." "I know." "Then, Torres," Mercer's voice was flat in the way it got when he was managing something that wanted to be louder than it could be. He turned in his chair. "I'm going to make a contact, outside the official chain. A SIGINT asset I've worked with before, civilian, former government, operates in the gray space on the Syria corridor. If Emma has been moving anywhere near that facility, this person can sweep for electronic signatures, radio attempts, passive emissions from her kit, anything that confirms she's alive and gives me a grid." Torres was quiet for a moment. "If Command finds out you used an unofficial contact, then they can court-martial an old man who's been court-martialed before." Mercer stood. He moved to the window that looked out on the base's vehicle staging area, which was currently empty and bright in the afternoon sun. "Emma Callahan is 29 years old. She went into that facility with the right equipment and the right training and was betrayed by someone who told the wrong people she was coming. I am not going to sit in this room filing paperwork while she dies in the desert because no one in my command chain can be bothered to treat the absence of a signal as something other than conclusive evidence." Torres looked at him. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay off comms. Don't tell Hayes. He's not ready for it. Don't tell Ruiz." A pause. "This didn't happen." "Copy," Torres said. He moved to the door. Stopped. "Mercer, she wouldn't give up." "I know she wouldn't," Mercer said. "That's the point." She found the American on day 5, by sound. She'd been working the eastern fence for 2 nights, mapping the guard rotations from outside the perimeter, logging timestamps and positions on the inside of her left forearm with a grease pencil she'd found in the abandoned service station. On the 5th night, she was moving along the fence line's eastern face when she heard something that stopped her mid-step. English. Quiet, repetitive, the specific cadence of someone reciting from memory. She stood motionless for 10 seconds, certain she'd misheard, and heard it again. A man's voice, slightly hoarse, speaking numbers. A sequence, repeated from the beginning when it reached the end. She followed the sound to a concrete outbuilding at the far southeastern corner. Pump house, low roof, no windows on the east or south face. A single ventilation slit near the base of the east wall, running roughly 6 inches high and 4 feet wide. She crouched beside the slit. U.S. military don't make noise. The recitation stopped. She waited 3 seconds and tapped twice on the concrete. A pause. Then, "Who's there?" American accent. Midwest, the flattened vowels of the central states, Indiana or Illinois or Ohio. Male, adult, not elderly. The voice had the hoarseness of someone who hadn't had adequate water recently, but the sentence structure was clear and organized. "U.S. Army," she said just above a whisper. "Are you alone in there?" "Yes, they come twice a day, morning and evening. Evening was an hour ago. You have time." A pause. "My name is Ray Decker, civilian contractor, SIGINT firm, Arlington office. I've been here 22 days. Emma stayed very still and ran the math on this. 22 days of captivity on whatever rations they were giving him. He'd sounded cogent on the phone, which meant they were feeding him enough to keep him functional. SIGINT contractor, the kind of person who collected intelligence for a living and therefore organized and retained what he'd seen. "Are you injured?" "Some, old injuries. Nothing that's going to stop me from moving if that's where this is going." She considered the fence line, the guard rotation timing, the physical gap between the pump house and the eastern fence. 30 meters of open ground. "Can you move fast if you need to?" Another pause. She got the impression he was being honest rather than optimistic. "Not fast, I can move." She pressed her back against the wall and checked her sightlines. Clear. "I'm going to get you out. Not tonight, I need more time in this section. Can you hold 24 hours? 22 days, yes. I'll be back before morning tomorrow. If anyone comes before then, you heard nothing tonight." "Understood." A pause and his voice changed slightly. Took on a different quality, as though he'd been waiting to say this and was now deciding he had to. "There's something you need to know before you go. About why I was taken. About what this operation actually is, and who's been running the intelligence side of it." She checked the fence line again. Still clear. Talk. Decker had been contracted by a private intelligence firm with direct Department of Defense relationships to run passive monitoring in the eastern Syria corridor, tracking weapons movement, financial flows, and communications patterns associated with black market networks operating in the Deir ez-Zor region. He'd been on the ground for 6 weeks undercover as an oil industry technical consultant before his capture. His cover had been solid. His capture had not been random. "Someone identified me," he said through the ventilation slit. "Not through a security failure on my end, through a data request. Someone queried my real identity through a channel they shouldn't have had access to, and the query itself triggered an alert in my firm's monitoring system. We logged it. I didn't know who made it or from where, but I knew someone had pulled my cover file 12 days before I was taken." Emma pressed herself against the concrete and listened. "The network has 2 components," Decker continued. "Physical, weapons moving through this facility in the eastern section, out to buyers across the corridor. That's the visible piece, the one your team was sent to disrupt. But there's an intelligence layer underneath it. Someone has been feeding this network operational data, U.S. operational data, movement schedules, comms frequencies, extraction routes, personnel assignments." He stopped. "It's not strategic intelligence. It's tactical, specific, targeted. The kind of information that comes from someone with JSOC-level access who knows exactly which piece of operational data will be most useful at any given moment." She kept her breathing even. How long? Based on what I intercepted before my capture, 8 to 10 months minimum, possibly longer before I had visibility. 8 to 10 months. She absorbed the number and didn't respond to it immediately, letting it settle into the existing architecture of what she knew. 8 to 10 months of systematic betrayal. Every operation that had touched this corridor in that period, every team that had gone into eastern Syria, every piece of equipment lost or personnel compromised. She didn't know the specific count, but she knew the corridor had seen significant operational losses in the past year that command had attributed to improved militia intelligence gathering. Nobody had been looking for a source inside the wire. She ran the math against what she'd seen in the facility's eastern section. The new welds, the fresh concrete, the power cable that had been run within the last few months. Someone had been running this operation for nearly a year with the confidence that only came from knowing in advance when disruption was coming. The facility's expansion timeline matched the breach timeline almost exactly. The data format, Decker said, I need to tell you about this because it's the piece that ties everything together. The intelligence feeds weren't just raw data dumped into a communication channel. They were formatted, structured in a way that matched U.S. operational reporting standards, verification codes, source authentication strings, the specific layering that JSOC uses internally to certify that an intelligence product came from a vetted source. He paused, choosing his words carefully, in the way of someone who had spent a professional lifetime being precise about language. Whoever is running the leak is using the same authentication formatting in the products they're selling. It functions as a hallmark, a guarantee to the network's buyers that this intelligence is genuine and comes from inside U.S. operational command. She thought about the manifest she'd photographed, the header format, the reference block structure. I photographed documents from the processing building, she said. Distribution manifests. The header format was recognizable, but I didn't have time to fully process it. Describe it. She described what she'd seen, the layering of the verification strings, the specific sequencing. Decker was quiet for a moment, then, that's it. That's the signature. The same format I intercepted in 6 weeks of monitoring before they took me. She let herself feel the weight of that confirmation for exactly 3 seconds. Then she filed it and moved forward. If I show you documents, the photographs I have, can you identify specific elements that would be verifiable in a U.S. intelligence system? Things that could be traced back to a source? Certain verification codes have embedded identifiers, Decker said. The authentication strings aren't random. They're generated from classified seed values that are tied to specific authorized users. If you have a photograph of one of those strings, a cryptographic analyst with the right clearance level can trace it to the originating terminal and the logged user. She pressed her back against the wall and processed this. The photographs in her vest pocket weren't just evidence of the network. They were potentially a trail directly to the source. If she got them to the right analyst, the strings would do the work of naming someone without her having to name anyone. I need to access the data from that laptop, she said. Can you describe the format in enough detail that I'd be able to recognize it in a document? I can do better than describe it, Decker said. If you show me the data, I can identify the specific signature. I've been looking at it for 6 weeks. I know exactly what it looks like. She heard movement somewhere to the north. A guard, the footsteps pattern of the south-face rotation coming around the corner of the main building 80 meters away. She pressed against the wall and went completely still, controlling her breathing to silence. The footsteps moved east along the wall and faded. She gave it 30 seconds. Tomorrow night, she said, I'll have more. I'm going back into the Eastern Section office. There are documents there I didn't have time to fully examine. I need everything they've got. She paused. Then we figure out how to get you out and where to take what we have. Take it to someone who can actually act on it, Decker said, not someone who'll route it through the system the leak uses. That's the problem I'm working, she said. She pulled back from the wall and moved east along the fence line in a controlled pace that her body wanted to make faster, and her training kept measured. The night was fully dark now, the stars overhead providing just enough light to navigate by on flat terrain. She gave herself one block of time, 30 seconds, as she moved through the open ground between the fence and the berm, to feel the full weight of what she was now carrying. Evidence of a systematic, long-running intelligence breach inside JSOC. A source who had been selling her team's operational security for a year. A civilian contractor who'd spent 22 days in a concrete room because the source had identified him. A manifest trail that potentially led directly back to a name, and nowhere safe to take any of it. She reached the berm and pressed against it and breathed and moved on, one problem at a time. Tonight's problem was movement and position. Tomorrow's problem was documents. The day after's problem was getting all of it to someone who could be trusted to do something with it. One problem at a time was how you stayed functional when the complete picture was too large to hold without it crushing something necessary. The response came back in 14 hours. Mercer's contact, a former NSA analyst named Walsh, who now operated in the independent space between government work and private intelligence, the kind of person who existed in every conflict zone as a necessary inconvenience to everyone who needed something done outside official channels, had run a passive sweep on the facility's grid coordinates and come back with a single result, a radio signal. Third day after the operation, 6 kilometers north of the main facility, a short burst, both primary and secondary frequencies, consistent with a standard U.S. military radio trying to punch through a jammer. Duration, 4 seconds, then nothing. But 4 seconds of a specific frequency signature was enough to confirm equipment type. And equipment type was enough to confirm she'd been alive on day 3. Mercer sat with this result for exactly 60 seconds, which was as long as he was willing to spend on reaction before shifting to action. He called the number. Walsh picked up on the second ring. "She was alive day 3, Mercer said. "I need to put a team in." "I can hold a bird in a 4-man package at Al-Tanf," Walsh said. 24-hour window. You give me coordinates, we go. "I need to find the coordinates first." "Then find them fast." Mercer put the phone down and looked at his screen. He had one mechanism available for locating a passive electronic signature in the eastern grid. A passive emissions survey request that could be routed through the JSOC Syria SIGINT cell. A routine request. The kind of administrative follow-up that happened after every disrupted operation, nominally to identify lost U.S. equipment. He drafted the request. Narrow scope. Eastern grid, 5-kilometer radius around the day 3 signal location. Passive only, no active interrogation. Phrased as equipment recovery follow-up. He routed it through the standard channel. The standard channel ran through Major Conrad Hale's office. Mercer didn't know, had no mechanism to know, that Hale had installed an alert protocol in the SIGINT routing system 6 months ago. A passive flag on certain grid coordinates. The flag didn't block the request. It just triggered a secondary notification to Hale's personal terminal whenever a query touched those coordinates. The request went through at 13:47 hours. At 13:49 hours, Hale's terminal received a notification. At 13:53 hours, Hale made a call on his personal phone. Mercer received his results the following morning, moved the coordinates to Walsh, and began preparing his extraction package with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided what was going to happen and was now simply making it happen. He told no one at Copperhead what he was doing. He had no way of knowing that the coordinates he just provided to Walsh and the search area they defined had already been provided to someone else. The office was in the secondary processing building's northeast corner, visible from the eastern berm on the second night of observation as a single lamp burning behind a window with a broken shutter. She watched it for 2 complete guard cycles. The guard rotation included the office window on the south pass, which gave her 11 minutes between passes. Not enough for what she needed to do in the daylight pattern, but workable at night when the guard's night adaptation made him slightly slower on the return. She went in through the east window on the third night, 7 minutes into the 11-minute window. Inside, a metal desk, a filing cabinet, a wall-mounted whiteboard with Arabic writing she photographed without reading, and a folding table with a printer and a box of manila folders. The air smelled like cigarettes and the specific dusty smell of documents that had been handled frequently. She opened the filing cabinet first. It was organized. She gave the network's logistics manager credit for that. Folders by date, most recent at the front. She pulled the 3 most recent and went through them at the desk with her red filtered flashlight. They were distribution manifests, inventory sheets logging weapons transfers, origin, destination, quantity, model designation. Each manifest had a header block that identified the transaction, a date, a transaction number, a destination code, and a reference block that was supposed to indicate the intelligence basis for the transaction's security assessment. She looked at the reference block on the first manifest. It took her exactly 4 seconds to recognize what she was seeing. The structure was unmistakable once she'd heard Decker's description. The layering of source authentication codes, the specific sequencing of verification strings, the format that JSOC analysts use to authenticate intelligence products internally. Someone had taken that format and embedded it in these manifests as a proof of authenticity marker for the network's buyers. The same hallmark on every transaction. A guarantee that the intelligence supporting this operation came from inside U.S. Operational Command. She photographed all 3 manifests, went through the next 4 folders, photographed 2 more sets of documents. Then she checked her watch. 3 minutes. She went out the window with 90 seconds to spare and pressed against the wall while the guard's footsteps passed on the south perimeter walk, 4 meters away. When the footsteps faded, she moved east and allowed herself 1 moment, just one, to feel the weight of what she'd found. Not relief, not triumph, something more complicated, because the weight of proof was also the weight of the thing the proof described. Nearly a year of deliberate betrayal. The careful, systematic sell-off of tactical intelligence to people who would use it to kill American soldiers, including her team, including Hayes bleeding on the ground at the South Gate, including Ruiz, whose status she still didn't know. She had what she needed. The question was what to do with it. She told Decker everything that night, through the ventilation slit with her back against the concrete and the desert cooling around them, speaking quietly and completely for the first time in 8 days. She laid it out in order: the briefing, Hale's pause, Torres's account of the comms kit question, the ambush, the pre-positioned vehicles, the IED, the isolation, the culvert and the heat stroke, and the 48 hours of rationing water before she found the standpipe. The eastern quadrant, the guard rotation, the flatbed trucks, the manifests with the authentication codes. Everything she'd seen, everything she'd concluded, everything she knew, and the one thing she still didn't: the name. Decker listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. In the quiet, she heard the desert, which was its own kind of noise, the faint movement of air across flat ground, the minute sounds of insects, the distant harmonic of a generator running somewhere in the eastern section. "You have enough," he said finally. "You have the photographs. You have the drive. You have my testimony. That's a case." "That's evidence," she said. "A case requires a proceeding. A proceeding requires a reporting mechanism." She paused. "Every official reporting mechanism I have access to runs through the command structure that includes the officer I'm looking at as the source. I file this through standard channels. It routes through his office or through channels he has visibility into. By the time it reaches someone with the authority to act on it, the evidence has been accessed and assessed by someone with every reason to ensure it disappears." Decker was quiet. She could hear him thinking. The quality of it, the deliberateness. "You need to go outside the chain entirely," he said. "Yes, which means I need someone senior enough to receive this evidence and act on it, who is entirely outside Hale's operational reach. Not just a different office, a structurally separate channel. Inspector General. That's where I keep landing." She shifted against the wall. "I met an IG officer 3 years ago. Colonel Rovick. She ran a debrief on an operation that had gone wrong in a specific way. Institutionally wrong. The kind of wrong that organizations work hard not to see clearly. She saw it clearly. She followed the evidence past the point where it was comfortable." She paused. "That quality, the willingness to pursue evidence regardless of where it leads institutionally, is what I need from whoever receives this." "You trust her?" "Enough, which is the most trust I'm distributing right now." She pulled the transceiver from her vest pocket and turned it in her hands. The plastic casing was warm from being pressed against her body. The charge indicator showed 60%, enough for the calls she needed to make if she was economical about it. The problem wasn't the device. The problem was location. If the transceiver's signal was being monitored, and she had to assume that any active signal in this grid was being monitored, then using it from her current position confirmed the search area for the vehicles she knew were looking for her. She needed to be somewhere else when she called, and she needed to call from a signal geometry that didn't point back to the facility, which was the one location she couldn't afford to burn before Mercer's extraction reached it. "How do you want to handle this?" Decker asked. "I move position tonight. You hold one more day. Tomorrow I make the call from distance. Get the IG channel established and coordinate your extraction simultaneously." She looked at the transceiver. "When the extraction comes, it comes here, not at a secondary LZ. The evidence stays together until it's in the hands of someone accountable for it. And if your call exposes your position," she'd thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since she'd first understood what Decker was carrying. "It will. Any active signal in this grid is going to be tracked. I'll have a window between the call and when they can respond. That window is when we need to be moving." "How long a window?" "In this terrain, with the vehicle assets they have, 2 hours if I'm lucky, less if I'm not." Another long pause. She heard him shift position inside the pump house. "One more day," he said. The same 3 words he'd said the last time she'd asked it of him. The same tone. Not a complaint, not a question, a confirmation. The sound of someone who had learned in 22 days how to hold on to the next manageable unit of time and not look further than that. She matched it. One more day. She moved the transceiver back to her vest pocket and pushed off from the wall. Checked her sight lines. Clear in every direction. She went north into the dark and thought about Colonel Rovick and hoped she still had the same sat phone number she'd had 3 years ago, and about the specific quality of the call she was going to have to make. Calm and precise and complete, with enough detail that Rovick would understand what she was holding, and enough restraint that she didn't say more than the channel needed to carry. One problem at a time. Tonight's problem was movement. Tomorrow's problem was everything else. The search vehicles appeared at dusk. She was 2 kilometers north of the culvert, having moved position that afternoon to a shallow depression behind a collapsed earthen berm that gave her roughly 40 centimeters of cover in the prone position when she heard the engines. She dropped flat and tracked the sound. 4 vehicles, approaching from the south on the service road, moving slowly, sweeping their headlights in overlapping arcs across the desert floor, in a pattern that was not random. It was systematic, coordinated, the light arcs timed to eliminate gaps between vehicle coverage zones. She watched them work the road for 20 minutes without moving anything except her eyes. This was not a patrol. A patrol moved with purpose through a fixed route. This was a search. 4 vehicles coordinating to cover ground, working outward from a center point that appeared to be approximately 3 kilometers south of her current position. The center point was close to where she'd held position for the last 2 days. The search pattern was too specific, too narrowly targeted on her general area to be based on anything except a known starting grid. Someone had given this network an updated position within the last 24 hours. Not a precise coordinate, because if they'd had a precise coordinate, they'd have sent people on foot, not vehicles doing a grid sweep. But a general area, a search radius, the kind of information that came from a signals intercept or a reported location, not from a visual sighting or an informant on the ground. She ran the timeline backward. The most recent event that could have generated a signals intercept was Mercer's passive emissions request. The SIGINT survey he would almost certainly have filed through official channels as the only mechanism available to him for locating her. The request would have gone through the standard routing. The standard routing ran through Hale's office. If Hale had a monitoring flag on the grid coordinates, and she had every reason to believe he would have built exactly that kind of protection into his position, the request would have triggered a notification that told him the search area his own subordinate was using to locate her. Mercer had been trying to find her, and in trying, he had told Hale where to look. She did not blame Mercer. She was incapable of it in this moment, not because the operational reality didn't permit it, but because she understood with complete clarity that what he'd done was what any good officer would do: pursue every available mechanism to recover a missing soldier, using the systems that existed, trusting those systems to serve the function they were built for. The betrayal was not his. The betrayal was the system itself, compromised at a level that made its good faith use a weapon against the people who relied on it. The vehicles passed her position at 300 meters on their closest arc, swept their lights across the ground between her and the service road, and moved north. She had at most 4 hours before they repositioned, possibly less. She looked at the transceiver. She'd told Decker tomorrow. She revised the timeline in her head, not with regret, but with the automatic recalculation of someone who had learned to treat plans as starting positions rather than fixed points. She crawled to the berm's east edge, confirmed the road was clear in both directions, and started moving north. Not the direction the vehicles had gone. Northeast. A vector they wouldn't anticipate for someone in her condition, moving toward what looked like worse terrain. Tonight. The call had to happen tonight. She moved northeast for 3 hours before she stopped. The terrain changed as she went, marginally, incrementally, in the way of flat desert that never became anything other than flat desert, but offered, here and there, the geological remnants of older landforms. A low ridge of compressed sandstone, a field of loose rock deposited by some ancient flood event. She worked her way into the rock field at 0230 and found a position with natural overhead cover from a sandstone overhang and a sightline east and west that gave her 400 meters of early warning in every useful direction. She sat with her back against the rock and checked the transceiver's charge. 58%. She'd been thinking about this call since the search vehicles had confirmed her timeline needed to move. Not just the mechanics of it, which number, what to say, how much to give, but the deeper question of whether the name she'd landed on was the right one. Trust in operational context was always a calculus, not a certainty. You assessed the available information about a person's character, their track record, their incentives, and you made a decision that you could defend on the available evidence. You didn't wait for certainty. Certainty didn't show up until after the decision had been made, and by then it was usually too late to change it. Colonel Sandra Rovick, Inspector General's office. She'd met her at a debrief 3 years ago, a closed session on an operation in the Horn of Africa that had gone wrong in a specific institutional way. Emma had been a witness. Rovick had been the investigating officer. The session had run 9 hours because Rovick had asked questions that followed the evidence rather than the institutional narrative, and kept asking them when the institutional narrative tried to reassert itself, and kept asking them until the distinction between the two was clear enough on the record to be undeniable. Emma had watched her do this without visible drama, without grandstanding, with the flat, persistent attention of someone who had no other interest in the room except the actual truth. That specific quality was what she needed right now. Not rank, not resources. The willingness to follow evidence past the point of institutional comfort. She pressed the transceiver's call key. The connection established after 4 seconds. A satellite handoff that she felt in the slight quality change of the silence on the line. Then a ring. 2 rings. 3. Rovik answered on the 4th. "It's Callahan," Emma said, keeping her voice to near nothing. "Staff Sergeant, 3rd Ranger, JSOC attached. I know I'm listed KIA. I'm not. I've been in grid for 10 days, and I have evidence of an active intelligence breach inside JSOC Syria Command. I need a direct reporting channel that bypasses the compromised section of the chain." A silence. 4 seconds, she counted them. "You're Callahan from the Objective Talon operation," Rovik said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You understand I'm going to need you to verify." She gave 3 verification elements: her service number, her unit authentication code, and a detail from the Horn of Africa debrief that only someone present could know. Rovik processed each one without comment. "Nature of the breach," Rovik said. "An officer in the JSOC Syria command structure has been providing tactical intelligence to a weapons distribution network operating through the Deir ez-Zor oil corridor for an estimated 8 to 10 months. The intelligence was formatted using U.S. operational verification codes as authentication for the network's buyers. I have photographic evidence of at least 6 distribution manifests with embedded JSOC verification strings, a data drive extracted from the site's primary laptop, and a civilian SIGINT contractor who was held captive at the facility for 22 days and monitored the comms intercepts during that period." She heard the quality of Rovik's silence change. "Do you have a name?" "Not a confirmed name, a profile. The routing of every hostile response to my team's operation and my subsequent movements traces back to requests filed through a single officer's office. The same officer presented the operational briefing and had prior opportunities to access our comms protocols and extraction routes." She paused. "A cryptographic analyst with appropriate clearance should be able to trace the verification strings in my photographs to a specific terminal and logged user." Another silence. Longer. "I'm going to give you a number," Rovik said. "DoD Inspector General Emergency Line, encrypted. Do not use this transceiver again. If it's being monitored, this call has already exposed your position. Are you mobile?" "Yes." "Get moving as soon as we disconnect. Call the IG number in 90 minutes from a different position. Give me that time to have a receiving officer in place." A brief pause. "The civilian contractor you mentioned, is he physically with you?" "Not yet. He's still at the facility. I'm extracting him simultaneously with the evidence." "Understood. One more thing." Rovik's voice shifted fractionally. "There's an off-book extraction team staged at Al-Tanf, assembled by a Master Sergeant Mercer. He's been trying to reach you for days through every mechanism he has." Emma closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. "Tell him I know what happened," she said. "Tell him it wasn't his fault." "I'll relay it." A pause. "Move now, Callahan." The line went dead. She moved immediately. Northeast, away from the rock formation, keeping the overhang behind her as cover for the first 200 meters, and then cutting east across open ground at the fastest pace her body would hold without generating excessive heat signature. The shoulder was worse than it had been on day 1. The torn structure had stiffened through the cold nights and loosened only partially in the days. She had a functional range of movement that was enough. She used it. She had 90 minutes to cover enough distance to make the second call from a meaningfully different location. In this terrain, with her current pace, That was 4 to 5 kilometers. She aimed for 5 and pushed. The desert at 0400 hours was the coolest it would get for another 22 hours. She used the temperature while she had it. She ran when the ground was firm enough to support a safe landing surface and walked fast when it wasn't. The last thing she needed now was a turned ankle at kilometer 3. She counted her paces and checked her watch and kept the calculation running in the background. Distance, time, position relative to the facility, the search vehicle's last known grid. At kilometer 4, she found what she was looking for, a decommissioned communications relay station. She'd noted it during her first day of northern movement. A concrete structure roughly the size of a one-car garage, clearly out of service for years. Solar panel on the roof still drawing passive charge, though the equipment inside was dead. The cellular repeater unit mounted on the exterior wall was still physically connected to the solar power feed. She stripped the antenna lead from the relay equipment with her multi-tool, wired it to the transceiver's external port using the paracord stripped to its conductive inner thread, and boosted the effective transmission range by a factor that would make the call cleaner and harder to triangulate precisely. The trade-off was that any signals monitoring in the area would see the boost as a flag. She had a window, call it 15 minutes from transmission to response time, for any vehicle-mounted monitoring unit, and she needed to be done and moving before that window closed. She dialed the IG number. One ring, a man's voice, professional and neutral in the specific way of someone trained to receive sensitive information without reacting to it. He exchanged verification strings with her. Rovik had been fast, and then she talked for 14 minutes without interruption. Everything, the full sequence, Hale's behavior in the briefing, the manifests, Decker's account and his 22 days of captivity, the verification strings, the drive, the search vehicles, and the timeline that connected them to Mercer's request running through Hale's office. The cryptographic trace she believed was possible. When she finished, the man on the line said, "You need to physically recover with all evidence materials. We can coordinate your extraction through a parallel channel entirely separate from JSOC Syria Command. Stand by for extraction coordinates." "I have an existing extraction asset," she said. "Master Sergeant Mercer, Al-Tamf. We're aware. His package can be repurposed to the parallel channel. He'll receive updated coordination through a contact we're establishing now." "And the civilian contractor?" "He extracts with you. His testimony is part of the evidentiary chain." A pause. "One more thing. The officer you've described, do not make contact with him. Do not signal your position to anyone in the JSOC Syria command structure before extraction." "Understood." She checked her watch. 11 minutes of transmission. "I need to move." "Go. You'll receive a signal in the next 2 hours with extraction coordinates." She pulled the antenna lead, pocketed the transceiver, and moved. She was 400 meters from the relay station when she heard the first vehicle engine coming from the south. The signal boost had done exactly what she'd known it might do. She went northeast at a dead run. She found Decker at the pump house at 0640, 40 minutes before the morning guard check. She went through the ventilation slit from outside, passing her multi-tool through first and talking him through the interior latch, a simple padlock hasp that had been installed assuming the door was the vulnerability, not the concrete slit. He was through in 4 minutes. He was thinner than she'd expected, even accounting for 22 days. The kind of thin that happened when caloric restriction combined with sustained psychological stress. Not starvation, but the metabolic deficit of a body running on insufficient fuel for weeks. The reserves burned and the baseline shifted in ways that would take months to properly reverse. His right knee locked on the first full step outside, something that had accumulated during 3 weeks of concrete floor and inadequate movement. He didn't complain. He found his weight, adjusted his gait, and kept moving. She kept her hand under his arm. The morning was pre-dawn cool, the desert at its most navigable. She'd grown to have a complicated relationship with this hour. The one time of day the environment was not actively trying to kill her, which made it the working hour, which meant it was also the hour when she was most vulnerable to the specific kind of exhaustion that came from trading rest for movement time. 10 days of this equation had left a debt she could feel in the backs of her eyes and in the heaviness of her legs on flat ground. She managed it. They moved north. Extraction is coming from the southwest, she said. Al-Tanf package, redirected through a parallel channel, won't go through Copperhead, which means it doesn't go through Hale's office. Decker was breathing with the focused effort of someone managing pain and fatigue simultaneously and refusing to let either one have his full attention. How long? Unknown. The IG contact said 2 hours from when I spoke to them. That was 90 minutes ago. So 30 minutes maybe. Maybe. He was quiet for 200 meters. The desert around them was still and gray in the pre-dawn, sound traveling differently than it would in an hour when the heat started and the air layered. She could hear the facility's generator a kilometer south. She could hear, further south, the sound of a vehicle that might be one of the search units repositioning for a morning run. She filed both sounds and kept moving. You called outside the chain, Decker said. Yes. Good. He didn't elaborate. She appreciated that he didn't. The thing had been done. The outcome was pending. There was nothing useful in discussing the decision at this point. He had the operational pragmatism she'd expected from someone who'd held himself together for 22 days in a concrete room on insufficient resources. They were 1 kilometer north of the pump house when the ground vehicle appeared. Not from the south, from the east. A single Land Cruiser moving fast along the service road that paralleled the eastern fence, and then slowing as it came even with their position. She pulled Decker into the wadi, barely a meter of depth, not enough for standing cover, but enough for prone, and went down beside him with the rifle up. The vehicle stopped. A door opened. Footsteps on the gravel road. Deliberate, not tactical, someone who wanted to be heard. Callahan! The voice came from her left, out of the wadi, from someone who had come up from the west on foot while the vehicle held their attention. A standard approach, noise on one axis, approach on another. She'd used it herself. She turned without lowering the rifle. Mercer was 20 meters away, standing in the wadi with his boots in the dry silt, in a stripped-down load configuration she'd never seen on him at a formal base. No unit markings, civilian plate carrier, the loadout of someone who had been operating outside official channels and had dressed accordingly. He was looking at her with the particular quality of attention he had when he was doing a full assessment and not showing the result of it yet. She lowered the weapon. He crossed the 20 meters without hurrying. He crossed the 20 meters without hurrying. He looked at her face, the shrapnel scar at the jaw, the 10 days of desert in her skin. The specific quality of her eyes that she knew, from training, was the look of someone who had been maintaining functional alertness under sustained stress for longer than the body endorsed. He looked at Decker, assessed him in the practiced way of a man who had been evaluating casualties for 3 decades. Then he looked back at her and said, "I'm sorry." She knew exactly what he was sorry for. You couldn't have known the request would trigger an alert. The flag was hidden in the routing system. You filed through the only channel you had. It put you in grid for 4 extra days. It also confirmed I was alive on day 3, she said, which is what kept you looking. She met his eyes. Don't carry it, Mercer. It's not the same thing as what he did. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once. The specific, contained way he had of accepting a thing without dramatizing it. He looked at Decker. Can you walk to the vehicle? Already walking, Decker said, which was technically true, even if the pace was approximately that of a man carrying a piano. Mercer moved to Decker's other side and took his weight without discussion. They moved to the Land Cruiser. 2 men in the vehicle, Emma didn't know, the Al-Tanf package, redirected through Walsh, who had apparently communicated the channel change with enough specificity that they were already running the updated mission without complaint. She sat in the back with Decker, and Mercer rode shotgun, and they moved south at speed along the service road. "Hale," she said. Mercer looked over his shoulder. "What about him?" "He flew in from Copperhead this morning. I don't know his exact position, but he came because the IG contact was triggered, and he knows the situation is moving outside his control." She paused. "He'll go to the facility, the processing building. The documents I photographed are still there, and the laptop data is still on the server. He knows what's on it, and he'll want to destroy it." "We can't let him destroy it." "No," she said. "We can't." The vehicle slowed. She found Hale in the processing building. He was at the filing cabinet when she came through the door, alone, his driver waiting outside as she'd anticipated he would, moving through the folders with the focused speed of a man who had a specific target in limited time. He stopped when he heard her and turned. He did not reach for a weapon. She noted that and filed it. "Staff Sergeant Callahan." His voice was controlled. The mask was good. She gave him that. Whatever was happening behind his eyes, the surface was professional. "You're officially KIA. I've been correcting that impression." She stood at the center of the room, M4 on its sling, hands visible. She'd made the same choice she'd made in the pump house slit, to have the conversation before the violence, because the conversation was the evidence and the violence was the failure mode. "Those documents you're looking for? The manifests in the third folder, dated last month. I photographed them 10 days ago. The photographs are in the hands of the IG. So is the data from that laptop." She touched the drive in her vest pocket. "And so is Ray Decker's 47-page account of 6 weeks of monitoring the comms intercepts that carry your verification strings." The mask slipped. Not completely, but she saw what was underneath it. Not the panic she'd expected, but something more tired. Something that had been maintaining the mask for a long time and was feeling the weight of continuing. "Verification strings can be spoofed," he said. "Decker's firm has its own interests in the region. You've been in the field for 10 days in extreme conditions. Your judgment and your testimony will both be questioned." He paused. "Courts look for certainty. Courts also look at patterns," she said. "And the pattern here is 8 to 10 months of tactical intelligence feeding directly from your office into this network's operations, correlating exactly with the timeline of U.S. operational losses in this corridor that command attributed to improved militia intelligence." She paused. "The cryptographic analysts are already running the verification strings. Whatever terminal generated those authentication codes will be in the report within 24 hours. Something changed in his face. The tiredness clarified into something more specific. "The network was already operational when they approached me," he said. "I want that on the record. Tell it to the IG. They're already expecting to hear from you." He looked at the filing cabinet, then at the door. She watched him work through whatever he was working through, the options, the outcomes, the gap between what he'd built and what it had cost and what came next. "The men in this network," he said, "you understand what happens to them when this unravels. The weapons stop flowing, the buyers look for other suppliers, the vacuum creates violence." "Major," her voice was flat, "Hayes almost lost his leg. Ruiz spent 3 weeks in a German hospital. You positioned a reaction force on the route you briefed us to use." She paused. "Don't talk to me about the violence the vacuum creates." He went very still. Then something released in him, the specific physical quality of a man who has been holding something enormous and has just put it down, even knowing what putting it down would cost. He straightened. He looked at her directly. "I won't run," he said. "I know." She stepped aside from the door. He walked out into the morning light without looking back. She heard him speak to his driver, heard the driver acknowledge, heard footsteps moving toward the vehicle that would take him to FOB Copperhead, where people would be waiting. She stood in the processing building alone for 30 seconds. She breathed. Then she walked outside into the full Syrian morning, which was already hot and bright and indifferent and enormous, and she found Mercer at the vehicle and got in. The helicopter lifted at 10:40 hours. Decker sat with his back against the airframe and his eyes closed, moving his lips slightly. Numbers, she realized, the same sequence he'd been repeating in the pump house. Old habit, she supposed, the mechanism that had kept him organized for 22 days. She understood it. She had her own equivalent. She was running her inventory in her head, the same list she'd run on day one in the drainage ditch. Not because it needed updating, but because the rhythm of it was familiar, and familiar was what she needed right now. 120 rounds had become 43. Her water bottle was full again. Mercer had given her his. The shoulder would take 6 weeks to properly heal and would ache at altitude and in cold weather for the rest of her life. Probably. Everything else was intact. Decker was medevaced to Ramstein, where he spent 2 weeks in the U.S. military hospital and gave a 47-page statement to the IG team that arrived on day 2. He was back at his firm's Arlington office by the end of the following month. She looked him up once, 6 months later. His LinkedIn profile said he was consulting on infrastructure security in the Gulf region. She was glad. Major Conrad Hale was detained at FOB Copperhead that afternoon. The investigation ran 7 months. It was the kind of investigation that expanded as it went, each piece of evidence pointing to adjacent evidence, each confirmed connection revealing the outline of others. 14 arrests across 2 continents. A congressional oversight process that generated reports she was never asked to present in public, but contributed to in written form. Sitting in her quarters at Fort Lewis with a laptop and a cup of coffee, writing with the particular precision of someone who understood that the words had to be exact because the people who read them would be looking for reasons not to believe them. She testified twice, once formally, once in a closed IG session that ran 9 hours. She answered every question she was asked with the same qualities she'd brought to every other task in the previous year. Accurate, complete, without drama. She went back to the unit for 6 months after the investigation closed. Then she put in for transition. Mercer met her in the parking lot on her last day. He was in his field configuration, which meant he was between something and something else, and had stopped deliberately to be here, which was its own kind of statement. He stood beside her truck and looked at the sky in the way he always looked at terrain he'd already mapped. Not absent, just already ahead of the moment. "Sure about this?" he asked. "No." "Good." He looked at her. "The ones who are sure at the end of something like this are the ones I wonder about." She held out her hand. He took it, held it a moment longer than the handshake required, not sentimental, just present, and let go. He walked back toward the building without looking back, exactly as she'd known he would, with the unhurried, particular purpose of a man who had already decided where he was going and was simply going there. She sat in the truck. 43 days, 10 of them outside the wire in eastern Syria with no comms, no support structure, a broken sidearm, and 4 magazines of rifle ammunition. A civilian contractor she'd had to physically support for the last 2 kilometers of desert. A case she'd had to build from photographs and memory, and the account of a man who'd repeated phone numbers to himself in a concrete room to keep his mind organized. She'd made it back. She wasn't certain what had come back with her. Some things she recognized, the instinct, the precision, the ability to hold a sight picture steady when everything else in the environment was noise. Some things she was still mapping. The way silence felt different now in rooms. The way she clocked exits before she sat down. The specific quality of sleep that was never quite complete because some part of her had learned to maintain watch. That was the after, its own terrain, and she was still finding her way through it. She started the truck. 6 months later, Fort Lewis, November. Torres found her at the range. She was running the same shoulder drill for the sixth time. Controlled draw, sight acquisition, trigger press, reload. Working the shoulder through the catch that had persisted into civilian physical therapy and would apparently persist past it as well. Torres came up beside her in his civvies, arm no longer in the sling, hands healed to a clean scarring that she knew would loosen in cold weather the way her shoulder would ache at altitude. Occupational residue. They both carried it differently. He waited for her to finish the repetition. Then he held out a small padded envelope, the bubble wrap kind that shipped small, dense items. From Mercer. He wouldn't explain what was in it, said to tell you don't make a thing out of it. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a folded paper towel, was a Ranger tab. Not hers. She had her own on the wall in her apartment. This one had a crease at the bottom edge and a faint discoloration at one corner, the specific wear pattern of something that had been handled over time. Taken off a wall, maybe, or carried in a pocket through enough days that the sweat from the fabric had worked into the dye. No note. She turned it in her hand. She thought about a man who had filed 11 requests in 72 hours and then gone outside every official channel available to him when the official channels failed, who had made one mistake in the course of trying to save her life and had apologized for it before she'd asked, who had stood in a Syrian desert and let her go back into a building that could have been occupied and watched her go the way he watched every decision she made, with complete trust, built through evidence, held without reservation. "Tell him I got it," she said. Torres waited. "That's all?" "He'll know what it means." Torres looked at her the way he sometimes did, like he was trying to solve something that didn't have a clean solution. And then he gave it up and headed back toward the range office, shaking his head with the quiet exasperation of someone who'd worked with both of them long enough to find this entirely consistent. Emma raised the rifle, drew through the shoulder catch, found the sight picture. She wasn't lost. She'd chosen the ground. And the ground, whatever it cost, had held.